Okay, welcome everybody. It's a pleasure for us to have here Dr. Joe Wunderle, who has kindly accepted to give us a talk on the effect of big storms on island birds. Bienvenidos a todos y todas los que están viendo. Esta charla va a ser en inglés por el profesor e investigador Joe Wunderle. Voy a hacer su presentación en español y él va a arrancar y hacer su charla en inglés. Su charla tratará sobre los efectos de huracanes y tormentas enormes sobre las aves del Caribe, gracias a la acumulación de muchos años de datos y experiencia en varias islas del Caribe y todas las Antillas. Enfocado principalmente en cuáles son las respuestas de estas aves a estos efectos grandes de los huracanes, su resiliencia y conservación. Pues Joe es un viejo conocido para los ornitólogos neotropicales. Él es biólogo y tiene un doctorado y maestría de la Universidad de Minnesota. Por muchos años estuvo asociado al Instituto Internacional de Bosques Tropicales, basado en Puerto Rico, y fue parte también del USDA, del Servicio Forestal de los Estados Unidos, basado en Puerto Rico. Joe ha servido y ha tenido un rol muy importante en nuestra comunidad de ornitólogos neotropicales. Incluso fue presidente de la Sociedad de Ornitología Neotropical y de la Sociedad de Ornitología del Caribe, y actualmente es el editor en jefe de la revista de Ornitología del Caribe, el Journal of Caribbean Ornithology. Joe tiene una larga lista de publicaciones e investigaciones en muchos temas, y sus intereses principales es la ecología, la distribución y la conservación de especies de aves tropicales del Caribe y especies migratorias, y la respuesta de estas aves a perturbaciones, tanto de la escala de un huracán como de la escala de perturbaciones que nosotros los humanos estamos efectuando sobre ellas. Entonces, yo quiero agradecer a Joe que haya aceptado venir a dar esta charla para todos ustedes y para ilustrarnos un poco de la experiencia de lo que han aprendido con investigación científica en todo el Caribe, de cómo los huracanes recurrentes que pasan por esta zona han afectado las aves. Toda vez que hace unos par de meses tuvimos, a finales del año pasado, a Iota pasando cerca de San Andrés y casi que por encima de la pequeña isla de Providencia, y en la que nos alertó de los grandes efectos que tuvo esto sobre la biota de Providencia. Entonces, sin decir nada más, quiero darle la bienvenida a Joe y que espero que disfrutemos la charla. Pueden hacer sus comentarios y preguntas en el chat de YouTube, y con gusto estaremos intercambiando estas preguntas con Joe. También esto quedará grabado, entonces podemos compartirlo pues con todos los que quieran aprender del impacto grande de huracanes sobre las aves. Joe, thanks very much for coming, and please take off.
Okay, well, thank you for that fine introduction. I'm happy to be able to talk with you about one of my favorite subjects. I got into the business of hurricane studies, like most people, by accident. I had baseline. That is, we had studies underway before these storms came in. It turns out, as I've worked all around the Caribbean, it seems almost every island that I have worked on has had a hurricane, and I've had baseline. I've not always been able to go back, but I'm going to talk about a number of these studies, and I'm going to talk about other people's studies to try and point out some patterns and some concepts that are useful for understanding these storms. Now, I'd like to add a little note to point out to my Colombian colleagues and friends that the first island that I ever visited in the Caribbean was San Andreas, the Colombian island. So thank you, Colombia, for introducing me to the Caribbean. I've been stuck in the Caribbean for many, many years, and we can thank San Andreas, that island, for my love of the Caribbean. Now, I have a couple of pictures here that are rather shocking, and I'm sure you have seen pictures like this or have gone out to islands or areas after hurricanes, but it can be very, very shocking. And you just ask yourself, well, how can anything survive this? And this is a picture taken before the arrival of Hurricane Hugo. That was one of our first major hurricanes in Puerto Rico. Closed canopy forest, rainforest, looks pretty familiar. The day after the hurricane, it looked like this, absolutely leafless. It was shocking. If you've been in the temperate zone in North America in the fall, this is what it looks like in November. However, it doesn't happen overnight, and this happened overnight. So, of course, you ask, well, how can any birds survive this? And that, of course, is the issue of interest. Well, as you well know, the Caribbean Basin is an area of very high hurricane activity, that is tropical cyclone activity, defined as hurricanes and tropical storms. And this is a diagram showing the tracks of tropical cyclones, hurricanes and tropical storms from 1851 to 2017. And as you can see here, and as you well know, of course, the coast of northern South America rarely gets many hurricanes. But as we get over in here and off of Nicaragua, and as you undoubtedly know, last year, both San Andreas and Providencia were hit by a class 5 hurricane. So they were severely affected. Where I live here in Puerto Rico, the incidence, the return rate of hurricanes is relatively high. Less than once every 16 years, the island is hit by a hurricane. Any one location on the island, the estimate is around 60 years. So we have a very high frequency. And this frequency of storms may be high enough, many ecologists believe, to actually shape the plant and animal communities that are found here. Now, there are several predictions about these storms, and I think many of you are probably familiar with this, but one of the predictions, and we're seeing it now, the frequency of the most intense hurricanes are increasing. That is the class 4 and class 5 hurricanes on the Saffir-Simpson index. The frequency of those storms is increasing. Hurricane Iota is an example of that. So was Hurricane Maria and Irma, which I'll talk about. The hurricane rainfall rates are increasing. That is, these storms are delivering more rain than historically has been recorded again. And a third factor, separate from the hurricane trends in the Caribbean Basin, is the increase in drought intensity. That is, increase in droughts from maybe the months of June through September. And some of these are extreme droughts, where you combine all of these things together, and it's possible that the ecosystems that we're familiar with now are going to change drastically. So there's real concern about the future of these particular events and what it'll do to the biota of the region. Now, hurricanes can have direct and indirect effects, and you're all likely familiar with the direct effects. They're fairly obvious: mortality from exposure to the winds, rain, and flooding. These are some pictures of recent hurricanes. This is a picture from Cuba of flamingos that were killed in a recent storm on the north coast of Cuba. These are pictures from Puerto Rico, a cattle egret and a tropic bird washed up on shore after a hurricane. And so we can find evidence of mortality. It's difficult to quantify because all sorts of things will, of course, prey on these or feed on these carcasses, so it's very difficult to have accurate counts of the dead birds. The other direct effect is that birds will be blown out of their normal ranges. The most common and most obvious examples are pelagic seabirds like the frigate bird or noddies, which are blown inland into continental areas away from their habitat. So these are common occurrences. As I said, I suspect you're all familiar with this. This is not what I'm going to focus my talk on today, however. What I'm going to focus on are these, and let me go back here, are these indirect effects. These are the effects that can have the longest lasting impacts on bird populations. And they're often not real obvious in number of instances. But some of the examples I give here, for example, the loss of food supplies and foraging substrates, very obvious after a hurricane. Change in the habitat structure and composition. If you have a closed canopy forest, afterwards you have many more gaps. That certainly has effects on the bird community. Change in the vulnerability to predators, competitors, and parasites. All of those relationships change after hurricanes and can affect bird populations. And of course, the obvious loss of nest sites, nest or roost sites. This is a particular problem for parrots, for example, which are cavity nesters, as you know. This in the Caribbean is an issue of concern. But let's take a look at the types of responses that have been documented in ecosystems after hurricanes. Now, this is a summary that Jess Zimmerman and his collaborators published following Hurricane Hugo in Puerto Rico in the Luquillo Mountains. And this is a graph which they produced in their paper where they've graphed the change in magnitude of populations or ecosystem components years after Hurricane Hugo. And these are idealized response trajectories. And the trajectories can be above the baseline or below the baseline, but this is the baseline that is non-hurricane system or population. This is what it was like before. The gray area shows, plus or minus 15%. So this is sort of an error bar, if you wish. And what you see on this graph is that there are some components of the ecosystems, populations, that actually show increases after hurricanes. One of the common components, and it's obvious in this picture here with all this dead biomass now on the ground, it's of course producing resources for certain organisms. So you have more wood on the ground, you have more leaves on the ground, and you get a sudden pulse of this material early after the hurricane. Others show an increase. It's more gradual. That's been shown in shrimp, Atia shrimp in rivers and streams. They increase because there's more cover to hide behind and escape predators. And the same for the Eleutherodactylus coqui, the coqui frog. After these hurricanes, they have more hiding places. This is a terrestrial frog. It breeds in bromeliads or in the woody debris on the ground. And of course, there's more places or refugia for these particular frogs. Then, of course, besides increases, you can have, of course, things that show no changes at all. And I don't show them on the graph here, but there are various nutrient cycling patterns and so on that are unchanged after these storms. And then, of course, the ones we all fear and we have evidence for are catastrophic declines in various organisms with varying rates of recovery after the decline. And they demonstrate here after Hugo in 5 years, there were increases in the common snail, Caracolus caracolus. They showed a decrease initially, but a very quick response. Similarly, for the bat species, Marcielago, this one being Artebius jamacensis, they showed after a decline a major increase. In fact, they increased above the baseline. They had more fruit available basically after 5 years. D shows a response or an increase that's not as rapid and just returns to the baseline. That was shown in a bat species, Stenoderma rufum, phylostomatid bat, which showed a recovery, but didn't overshoot like the Artebius. And the diversity and the biomass of the trees pretty well recovers. They didn't lose any tree species. The species richness remained the same after the hurricane and showed some recovery here. And then there were other organisms that showed other and slower increases. This phasmid, or walking stick in English, the phasmids showed a decrease, and in the 5-year period that they followed these responses, this animal did not recover. It turns out that after 10 or 15 years, it did recover, but in the 5 years here, it didn't recover. Now, to understand these graphs, it's useful to break them down into several components. And the first component that I want to focus on, and a definition, is the term resistance. And this is the degree to which a characteristic of an ecosystem or population remains unaffected by the disturbance. And this was a definition provided by Wade and Willig in their work on disturbance in the Luquillo Mountains. Same type of graph as you saw earlier, changes in magnitude here, either above or below the baseline. The hurricane comes along, and then you see that the population A shows a slight decrease and then returns, whereas B and C show a much more marked decrease. So we say that the resistance of population A is greater than the resistance of population B or population C. Now, let me give you an example that's of interest and of conservation importance. And I'm going to give you an example first with plants, with palms. Palm trees in the Caribbean are highly resistant to hurricane damage. And these are photos after various hurricanes. I believe all of these are after Hurricane Maria, so that's a recent hurricane. But my point here is that all of these vertical stems are palms. They've lost many of their palm fronds, and not all of them, as the Roystonia here shows, and the Cocos nucifera have lost most of their palm fronds. But despite losing their fronds, there's relatively little mortality of these species, maybe 4 or 5% mortality of these stems. So the palms are very quick to recover. Very few of them actually die, and they can play an important role in recovery after the storm because of their high resistance. So that's an example, and we'll look at a bird example a little later. The other concept of importance and related is the concept of resilience. This is basically the recovery time of the population or the organism. In other words, the time required to return to the pre-disturbance baseline condition. So I'm showing the same type of graph here, same idea, baseline here, and the several different populations here. And we see that A, which was quite resistant, also is quite resilient because it returns to the baseline relatively quickly. B, however, takes a little longer, shows a greater decline and returns here to the baseline. And finally, C shows a slower recovery. So we say the resilience of A is greater than B, which is greater than C. And of course, you can have populations such as D that show no resilience whatsoever. They decline and they remain at that low level. Now, I would point out that in the areas studied in the Loquillo Mountains for these hurricanes, they've not documented any extinctions or loss of species from these storms as yet. So that's an encouraging thing, although there is an example from the parrots that is very close to that. Now, let me give you a vegetation example of resilience. And let's compare high elevation cloud forest with the lower elevation rainforest. So these are pictures from Jamaica after Hurricane Gilbert. 4 months after Hurricane Gilbert, we went back to the island of Jamaica and resampled or recensused areas that we had studied before the arrival of that storm. And one of the things we noticed right away at high elevation, the mountains there, was that the trees showed no sign of recovery. This is 4 months after the storm. They were not putting out new leaves. There was no growth. They still were leafless. In the lowlands, however, this was right at sea level or close to sea level, there was a tremendous amount of recovery underway after 4 months. You can see that a tree has fallen here and a vine has grown over it. So this is within 4 months. You can also see that the trees have put out leaves after 4 months. In fact, a lot of these leaves are coming right out of the trunks of the trees, which is quite startling to many of us who initially were not familiar with hurricanes, but a lot of these trees in the areas where there are hurricanes can actually put leaves out of the main trunk. But my point here is that here we show two examples of resilience. Resilience being relatively slow at high elevation and being relatively quick down in the low elevations. Well, what happens to the bird populations in these two areas with different levels of resilience? Well, let's go to Jamaica again. These are the areas that I sampled. These were done with point counts. These are basically simple counts where observer stands for 10 minutes, records all the birds seen and heard within that period, and then after 10 minutes, they walk off to 100 meters or so and replicate that method until they have 15 points completed in a morning. We did this before the arrival of the hurricane. We were doing bird surveys all over the island of Jamaica, from the highest points in Jamaica to the lowlands in all of the possible habitats on the island. After we completed our study, which was done in December, the following year in September, a hurricane went through all of our study sites, causing major damage. We went back, replicated our methods, point counts, same places. They were all geo-referenced. We were able to go back and measure. And these are the results of our point counts. What we've done for this analysis is we've compared the high elevation or montane sites, 3 different habitats above 1,300 meters, with lowland habitats, diversity habitats. And in each habitat, what we did was we simply tallied, that is, counted the direction of the population change after the hurricane. And we put them in 2 categories. So for each species, we determined whether it showed an increase, or excuse me, a decrease after the storm, or showed an increase or no change. And as you see here, in the montane areas, there were more populations of birds, each species, each population showing decreases, more decreases than showing increases or no change. In contrast, in the lowlands, you see that the numbers are relatively similar. In fact, actually some evidence for higher numbers, that is more increases in populations after the storm than before. So the fact here, and the important point, is that we see more decreases in these higher elevation habitats. And these are habitats that are not resilient. And they're not resilient because, as any legitimate plant physiologist will tell you, plants at higher elevation grow more slowly. Even without a hurricane, we know this. And of course, after a hurricane, they grow more slowly, of course, and their recovery is lower. Well, this, of course, has effects on the bird populations. Now, this is applicable to islands that are not mountainous because there are habitats that show more resilience than others, and it's not always related to elevation. But it was quite obvious to us after we surveyed in Jamaica. Well, let's take a look at these birds and see who they are. And to do that, we divided the birds into foraging or feeding guilds. And fortunately in Jamaica, there have been ample studies that we could rely on to be able to classify the birds into different diet groups. And we focused only on the terrestrial species. We classified them into nectivores, those birds feeding on the nectar of flowers, hummingbirds colibris being good examples, or birds that fed on fruit or seeds, things like parrots and tanagers and so on, or finches. And then we broke the insectivores into two categories: the resident insectivores, that is the Jamaican species that reproduce in Jamaica, and the migrant insectivores. These are Nearctic migrants that overwinter in the Caribbean, and most of them are insectivorous. So we broke these into two categories. We then did the same type of analysis that I told you before, where we simply tallied or counted the number of populations that decreased versus the numbers that increased or showed no change. And as you can see here, there were more decreasing populations, 8, small sample size, but 8 decreasing versus 2 populations that showed an increase or no change. For the frugivore seed eaters, however, it's much more marked, the difference. 19 showed decreases, whereas only 4 showed increases or no change. For the insectivores, both categories, virtually no difference. The migrant insectivores, there was difference, just a small difference here. So very little difference in the populations of the insectivores relative to the species that feed on either flowers, nectar, or fruit and seeds. The insectivores are useful to look at for an important reason, an important part of my story. The resident insectivores were the birds that were present in Jamaica when this powerful hurricane came through the island. This was a storm that came through in early September, and of course all the resident insectivores were there. Most of the migrants had not yet arrived in Jamaica, so most of these birds, these migrant insectivores, were not present on the island when the storm went through. And yet the responses here are quite similar. And the fact that we see a diet effect after these storms strongly suggests that the strongest impact on terrestrial birds of a hurricane is not the storm itself. Yes, there can be some mortality, but it's after the storm, in the aftermath, that things become difficult for the birds. This is when the declines occur, and I'll show you evidence to support this. But one of the first questions, of course, is what's going on with these insectivores? Well, think about the insectivores and think about the insects. Most of the insects, or many of the insects, were in different stages of their life cycle. Some were in the egg stage, the larva stage, the pupa stage. And even if the adults were killed in the storm, or blown away. Nonetheless, their annual cycle is so fast that they can quickly recover. So you take the adults away, and the next instar group, for example, comes out, and so on. So the insects recover quite quickly. In fact, you can get major outbreaks of defoliation, as you can see on the Cecropia here. Insects were feeding on the Cecropia after the storm. The same thing here on a Schefflera. Totally defoliated. Here you can see some Coleoptera, some beetles feeding on a rubiaceous plant. And we don't see these types of insect outbreaks normally in the Caribbean. These are actually quite rare in our rainforest. But after hurricanes, we do see them. And of course, they can provide food for the various insectivores, such as this gray kingbird. So what happens to the flowers and fruits? Well, the same winds that remove the leaves and bring down the trees, of course, remove flowers and fruit. And we demonstrated this in Puerto Rico at mid-elevation in a location where we had phenology studies underway. That is, we had baseline allowing us to come back and see what happened. We had 100 plants, mostly trees, a few vines, that were marked and labeled. We were following their phenology on a monthly basis. And we had 2 years of data from these marked plants before the arrival of Hurricane Hugo, and then we were able to go back afterwards and see what happened. And these are the data shown for the October periods when we did our phenology censuses. And here you can see the number of plants, or excuse me, the percentage that had flowers before the storm, two baseline periods here, followed by the October after Hurricane Hugo. You can see a decline in the percentage of plants that had flowers. Unripe fruit, you can see here relatively high percentage, afterwards a decline. And for ripe fruit, you can see the 2 periods, 2 Octobers before the storm. Afterwards, there were no trees with ripe fruit. They look very much like this. Okay, so animals that are reliant on flowers, fruits, and seeds are at greatest risk. Okay. Let's take a look at what these species look like that change. I thought you might want to see what they look like. We had a colibri, Trochilus polytemus, the streamer-tailed hummingbird, the national bird of Jamaica. They showed major declines in montane cloud forest, montane coffee plantations. These were sun coffee plantations, as well as montane pine plantations. The orange quit, or Uniornis campestris, which is a tanager. It's an endemic species. They showed major declines in montane pine plantations and montane coffee plantations. The black-faced grassquit used to be Tierras bicolor. It's now Melanospisa bicolor. Showed declines, interestingly enough, in dry limestone scrub, not in the high elevations, which was a surprise. And the yellow-shouldered grassquit, Loxopasser, which is another endemic species, declined markedly in these high elevation locations. We also had a Nearctic migrant, Neotolta varia, which is, many of you may be familiar with it. It does come down to Colombia in the winter. Quite common in the Caribbean. Now, this, of course, is an insectivore. And what's the story with the decline of this insectivore? Well, this bird feeds, as many of you may know, on the branches and twigs of trees, and it picks insects off the surface, off the bark of these twigs and branches, once in a while off the surface of a leaf, but it forages mostly on branches and twigs. And what had happened was it lost its foraging substrate. Basically, all of those branches and twigs fell down in the montane pine plantation, as well as in the lowland shade coffee. What happened in the lowland shade coffee is that the canopies of these coffee plantations came off, they disappeared, and that canopy, of course, is where the black and white warbler fed. So it lost its foraging substrate. So these are some of the species that show those declines. Now, birds can respond in interesting ways to these storms, and they can move, which is one of the advantages of having wings. One of the types of movements, a short-term or short distance movement, the movements of montane or high elevation species into the lowlands. And we saw this in Cerebral flaviola, that is the bananaquid, which, as you may know, is exceedingly abundant in the Caribbean and quite abundant where we studied them in Puerto Rico, Luquillo Mountains, but in Jamaica, quite common. And here we found after Hurricane Gilbert that they showed major declines in montane pine plantations, montane coffee plantations, yet they showed increases in wet limestone forest in the lowlands and dry limestone forest in the lowlands. This pattern is consistent with an elevational migration, a movement out of these habitats into the lowland habitats. There can be more localized movements, however, and that was shown nicely with our endemic species of Totus, unfortunately named Totus mexicanus rather than puertorricensis, but the Totus, or tody, is a canopy dweller. And after the hurricane in Puerto Rico, in fact, all of our hurricanes in Puerto Rico, these data are from Hugo, but same with the recent storms, we found more of them before at ground level than ever before. These are results from mist netting samples where we had baseline before the storm went through. And this shows the captures per net hour for canopy dwellers versus understory dwellers. And this Totus is an example of those canopy dwellers. And here you can see that our capture rates were relatively low in the understory before the hurricane, but after the hurricane, we had 3 times as many captures. Of course, there was no canopy. The understory species, however, this is a mix of species, showed absolutely no change in the capture rates. So it was really the canopy species that were forced down into the lower levels of the forest, and they were foraging there and more likely to be captured and more likely to be seen. And this has been a common occurrence after many hurricanes. A lot of people are surprised at how many species and how many birds they see after these storms. Well, let's take a look at a case of actual mortality, as best we know, from these storms. It's hard to determine whether bird populations simply moved to another location or whether it's actually killed the birds outright. But we do know this for one of the Amazon parrots, in this case, the Puerto Rican parrot, a very highly endangered species. Here I show a graph of the populations or the population in the Luquillo Mountains. Starting in 1973, the population was very low. Here we show about 15 birds. Before that, they were down to 13 birds in the wild. With very intensive recovery efforts, however, they brought the population up, showing here about 37 or so. Hurricane Hugo came through in 1989, knocked the population back by almost half. Then with massive management, nest guarding and putting out birds from the aviaries. They increased the population, and then Hurricane Georges came along and knocked the population back again. These declines, we believe, are related to mortality rather than simply to migration or movement to other parts of the island. And the way we know this is by the studies of the breeding birds. All of the breeding parrots are monitored intensely. They have blinds where they observe the birds, they've been banded, they know the breeding individuals, and they can determine whether the breeders have returned to their traditional breeding cavity. The birds are quite site faithful, and they will generally always return to the breeding site unless the breeding site is gone, the tree has fallen down, or the bird's dead. And if you look at the average annual survival, return, if you wish, to the nest cavity of a mated pair, it's 88% on average annual survival, which is quite high for a parrot. But in hurricane years, Georges, it dropped to 50%, and Hugo, it dropped to 70%. And we do believe that this is attributable directly to a mortality and not simply to movement or migration elsewhere on the island. Now, let's use parrots as an example of resistance, because it turns out these parrots can come through these storms quite well, and this may explain the results of the Puerto Rican parrot. And I'm returning to the graph, the idealized graph that I showed earlier, showing the change in magnitude of a population, and the baseline here, this is the baseline before the hurricane, and here I show three populations, two species of Amazon parrots, one being the Amazona ventralis, the Hispaniolan parrot, as well as down below here, the Puerto Rican parrot, Amazona vittata. And this is a remarkable study that was conducted by Jaime Collazo and collaborators. They had 25 Amazon ventralis radio tagged. That is, they had radio transmitters on these birds, and they were following them for several weeks before the arrival of Hurricane Georges, which was a Class 3 storm that went through their study site, causing massive damage to the habitat. Yet, the day after the storm, they were able to locate all of their parrots alive, with the exception of one bird. And one bird disappeared, it's presumed dead, but 24 of the 25 birds survived the storm, suggesting remarkable resistance to this storm. And however, with time, they began to lose parrots, and these, they believe, were a result of mortality, and they lost about 5 birds several months afterwards. Well, they know these birds were moving more widely. They know there was almost no food around. The birds expanded their home ranges, and basically the conclusion was they probably starved to death, or predators got them. The case of Puerto Rico, in our recent hurricanes, this was a Class 4 storm. Hurricane Irma hit us in September 2017, and 2 weeks later, we got hit by Maria. And the resistance of these populations, one at Rio Bajo, center part of the island, and the other in the Loquillo Mountains, was quite different. And I'll show you the exact numbers in the next slide. But this is the resistance measured before the birds actually began to breed. So this is the first year after the storm. So here we can see considerable difference. This was a Class 3 storm. This was, in the case of Maria, a very high Class 4 storm. In fact, it was a Class 5 storm before it hit the island of Puerto Rico. So it was a very, very powerful storm. Back to the parrots, the Puerto Rican parrots here. Here we can see the track or the path of Hurricane Maria as it crosses the island of Puerto Rico. Luquillo Mountains are here in the northeast, and then Rio Bajo is shown here. These are the results of the counts, censuses of the parrots in the Luquillo Mountains prior to the arrival of Hurricane Maria and Irma. I don't show Irma here, but Irma passed here. So the Luquillo Mountains got hit by 2 storms. That's Rio Bajo, but it was much more powerful in the Luquillo Mountains. So there were really 2 hurricanes here. Before those storms, there were 53 to 56 birds before. Afterwards, there were 2 birds found after the storm. In contrast, here in Rio Bajo, even though the storm went through here and tremendous damage, before the storm, there were 130 to 136 birds. After the storm, 70 to 80 birds, or a decline of 45%, versus a decline here in the Luquillo Mountains of 96%. Quite a difference. What accounts for that? Well, one of the factors is related to feeding of the parrots. The way in which they manage the parrots in the Rio Bajo forest is that when they release them from the aviary, they continued to feed them. So the birds, the parrots, knew where to find food. And after the hurricane, they put out the feeders and the birds came in and they were able to feed. There was no supplemental feeding in the Luquillo Mountains. And even if there had been, it's unlikely that the parrots would have found them because there was no effort to condition the bird to feeding. So this appeared to be a very useful and successful management effort. And no surprise, they are now feeding the birds here in the Luquillo Mountains. So this is really is a major factor in the differences in the decline, 45% relative to 96% decline with the same storm. Now let's look at recovery or resilience of bird populations. And basically, a lot of what explains it in birds are the reproductive differences and the reproductive rates. And this has been looked at by Frank Rivera Milan and his collaborators, as well as Michael Akrish. And I'm showing some of their data here. Same type of graph I showed you before, change in magnitude, our baseline shown here, standardized for all of our populations. And these are all populations that showed catastrophic declines after the storm, and then the periods at which the recovery had occurred. And these are data taken from several different hurricanes. But basically, it shows that, for example, in the case of Setophaga angelae, they basically returned after 2 years. This is an endemic species in Puerto Rico. It's a high elevation species in the montane forests, and it recovered quite quickly. A Melanerpes woodpecker on the island of San Salvador in the Bahamas, they recover in about 2 to 3 years and relatively quickly. A little more slowly was the pigeon, paloma, the plain pigeon or Patagoneus inornata in Puerto Rico. It takes about 4 years to recover. And then finally an Amazon, this one in the Bahamas, Amazona leucophila, takes about 5 years. Well, if we look at the clutch size of the Setophaga, clutch size is about 3. They'll have more than 1 clutch in a breeding season. The Melanerpes, of course, has a relatively high clutch, maybe 3 eggs, but only 1 clutch per breeding year. And the plain pigeon, the paloma, only has 1 egg and 1 clutch per year. So, of course, their recovery is going to be much slower. And the Amazon, the Amazona Leucocephala has a clutch of 2 to 3 eggs, but they only breed once a year, so they don't have multiple clutches. So here's a species with multiple clutches, relatively quick recovery, single clutch, but relatively large, very small clutch, and no repeat clutches in the same breeding year. So the reproductive potential of these birds explains a lot of the recovery. Now, of course, the habitat has got to recover also, and the food resources have got to be there. All right, so what do we do? Well, let's look at some examples from these hurricanes, because we've all, of course, been alarmed, and we've looked at the damage to, well, of course, the damage to people's homes and loss of life and so on, and the loss of habitat. So the question is, what can we do about it? And these are photos of efforts that were undertaken in the recent after the recent hurricanes. These are the parrots that I showed you earlier in Puerto Rico, where they fed them. And these are feeders that were put out after the hurricanes. And of course, here you can see all the cerebral flaviola, the bananaquits, coming in to feed on the sugar water, and of course the colibris flocking in high abundance. And Birds Caribbean, which is a nonprofit organization that supports bird conservation throughout the Caribbean, undertook a program called Operation Feeder Rescue. And they had it was a very incredible, I've got to move this here, incredible effort. Let me go back here. After the passage of Hurricane Irma, this is the track through the Eastern Caribbean, Northeastern Caribbean, and then going up, and then Maria. Both of these storms, as I said, were about 2 weeks apart. They were devastating. They hit a large collection of islands, and folks were very concerned about the birds. And Birds Caribbean basically set up a rescue program where they shipped out of Miami hummingbird feeders, 4,200 of them, bottles of nectar, that is sugar water, and special food for the colibris and the bananaquits, other nectivores, and 5 tons of bird seed for the birds. And they shipped them out to 18 different islands. It was an incredible feat how they got them out there to these various islands. Is an interesting story, but nonetheless, they got a lot of local support. Here's some efforts of the partners of Birds Caribbean, where they organized giveaway events for these feeders, where they gave them to various community groups, told them how to feed the birds. Here are students of the various islands, from Dominica, Puerto Rico, St. Eustatius, Barbuda, Dominica, various islands. And here they are shown feeding these birds, or putting the feeders out. Now, one of the other post-hurricane conservation interventions that's common is to replace nest sites or nest cavities. And as you might guess, parrots suffer considerably after these storms, because they require old trees with large old cavities, and those often are destroyed. So the managers will put out nest cavities for them, as shown here for the Puerto Rican parrot. It's been done also on other islands. I believe the Cayman Islands have put out cavities for their parrots, which the parrots have used afterwards. This is an example of a woodpecker species, not a Caribbean species, but a species that uses old growth pine, and they had to basically make artificial cavities. They cut them out for this bird, and it increased their populations. Without it, they would have lost some of their populations of this endangered species. More intensive work has been done with the Puerto Rican sharp-shinned hawk, Accipiter striatus. This is an endangered species. It had a population before the hurricane of about 75 individuals. After the hurricane, the population was down to something like 17 individual birds. So the population suffered greatly after the passage of Irma and Maria. And a conservation group, Peregrine Fund, started a recovery effort where they took the eggs of the sharp-shinned hawk out of the nests, put them in incubators, and basically hand-raised them in captivity. And the reason for that is because the nest predation and parasitism by botflies, Phalaenus, was so high after the hurricane that there was just no productivity at all. So they were very concerned about it. So they brought it in, brought those eggs into captivity and had tremendous success rearing the eggs to the chick stage and then to a juvenile stage, and then they put them out into the wild and were quite successful returning them to the wild. So this is another method that has been used, but as you may imagine, it's rather costly and labor intensive. Strategies we can use, well, as I've emphasized before, protect resilient habitats because these can be important post-hurricane refugia. And I gave an example from Jamaica, but there are other examples where if you protect, you have these montane reserves, you require lowland areas for quick recovery. We need to protect habitats in the lowlands to serve as refugia after the hurricanes for these montane species to move down into those habitats. Also encourage resistant and resilient plants. I mentioned palm trees before. Examples, as I said, palms are remarkably both resistant and resilient to hurricanes, and at least the frugivores and seed eaters that feed on the palm fruits will in fact take advantage of this, and we've seen this on a number of islands. And finally, the same old message that you've heard over and over: preserve habitat. Without question, the more habitat you have out there when a storm goes through, the higher the chances that your populations of birds and other animals, of course, will survive. There's a higher risk in small patches. There's just no question about it. So with that, I thank you, and I'm happy to take your questions.
That was wonderful, Joe. Thanks very much for such a summary of long-term research on these effects on birds across the Caribbean. I'd like to maybe let the people in the panel, Felipe, Camila, David, if they have questions for Joe. Because there are no questions from the public in the YouTube channel, I'll close the streaming at that point and then continue our conversation about the Providencia, maybe ideas to take place based on this. I may have a quick question though, Joe. When did people start to realize that they had to do some management? Some intervention, either focusing on the direct effects or the indirect effects. Like, I guess it was a lot of trial and error and a lot of experience, like getting these storms come through often. But when people started to realize that having some management before the storm was positive for the aftermath.
That's relatively recent. In the case of the Puerto parrot, because there's been so much effort, conservation effort, focused on it, they realized that if there was a storm, they would have to put up nest boxes, nest cavities after the storm. They did not, in the early years, know how to set up a feeding program. And in the early years, they wanted to keep them wild. They did not wish to have that feeding program. Excuse me. We now realize, after a hurricane as powerful as Maria, a class 4, a high class 4 hurricane, that you want to do something if you can. So that's relatively recent knowledge, and it's come out of the Parrot Project. The Operation Feeder Rescue, there's really never been anything like that. That's the first time anybody ever tried it at that scale. Now, there are local people in the Caribbean, and all of us, myself included, we, of course, always put up feeders afterwards, because we know that our colibri populations will decline, as will the Soreba, the bananaquits. So we, of course, did that, but it was never done in an organized fashion. And a lot of the organized fashion came out of these intensive endangered species recovery efforts. The people who did the accipiter study, they were with the Peregrine Fund, which, as you may know, specializes on raptors, and they have a lot of experience with the recovery of raptor populations. So it was natural for them to adopt their post-hurricane methodology very quickly. So they were able to do that quite well. But the broader issue of feeding the birds, as Birds Caribbean did, is new. And one of the pluses out of that program is that it involved local people, and it involved local people in conservation, and it gave them ownership of their birds, which was very, very important. And on these islands, many of the local people, their endemic birds are important to them. And it was shown after the hurricane. Many of the people in those photos were living in homes with no electricity, and having problems getting water and so on. So the people themselves were suffering, yet they were willing to feed the birds because they wanted to do something for them, which, pretty cool.
Can I ask a question?
Yes, you can.
Thank you. I really enjoyed your talk. Thank you very much. I was wondering, have you always noticed that the assemblages and, I guess, habitats go back to their same composition? Or have you noticed that a certain assemblage or system shifts permanently after a hurricane, like turning into something different, perhaps, than it was before?
Good question. Most of the sites that I'm familiar with, the time period, maybe 10 years or so, things seem to have returned. Let me give you an example, however, where we believe the return will be much longer than that. And this is in the Bahamas, where there are pine forests. And there's a bird community that specializes on the pine trees. Well, the pines are very susceptible to salt water. That is, if there's any flooding, a storm surge, for example, which floods these low-lying Bahamian islands and kills those pines, there's a possibility that the pine forest will be lost and may not be able to return for a good number of years. So you can actually change the forest type. And if you change the forest type, you, of course, change the bird community. So in that case, it could take 25, 50 or more years. We don't know. We have some data from the recent hurricanes, a class 5 hurricane that hit Abaco in the Bahamas. We have the vegetation measurements beforehand. We just haven't been able to get back afterwards because of the because of COVID, but we'd like to go back. So there's an example where the bird community could take a long time to come back. What we're afraid of is if you add droughts to these most powerful hurricanes, the class 4 and class 5 storms predicted to become more common, that you'll end up with not a forest in the Caribbean, but a sort of a matorral, a shrubland. And that, of course, will affect the bird community. So we are concerned about that. And that's a distinct possibility. But so far, the studies that have been done, at least in the Loquillo Mountains, the forest has pretty much begun to come back, but it does take a while. And the bird community, I'm tying the two together. But I can give you an example where the bird populations have not yet come back. Of course, the Puerto Rican parrot is an example, but the euphonias, if you're familiar with euphonias that feed on Loranthaceae berries, their populations have dropped tremendously in these areas hit by hurricanes, and you can understand why, because they are highly specialized on those fruits of Loranthaceae. And of course, those are parasitic plants that grow out on the branches of trees, and with a hurricane taking the branches off, of course, there goes the fruit, and their populations have really crashed. And in Puerto Rico, they still have not recovered. So 3 years after Irma and Maria, we still have very low counts of those birds.
Okay, I have another question, and I encourage David and Felipe, they have questions to ask them too. So people in Colombia, we're not very familiar with hurricanes. And so we got hit by Iota that passed very close to San Andres and almost over the small island of Providencia. And Providencia is a really small island, right? It's very small. Looking at some data on areas of the Lesser and Greater Antilles, Providencia ranks like 104 over 126 total islands. It's a very tiny island. San Andres is small too. It ranks number 89 of all the islands, with Cuba being the largest, obviously. So the studies that you have shown, providing all this baseline information and on different islands and Jamaica and Puerto Rico, when you have also a topographic complexity with bird specialization on different mountain ranges, and then you have detected these downslope movements of birds after hurricanes. But we're perplexed here because we have these two really tiny islands, which are basically might be covered totally by the eye of a hurricane, right? And then, so we have the complexity of a really small island. But at the same time, you'll see that people is worried, obviously, because of the endemic or resident land birds in these islands, particularly the two vireos that are endemic to each of these two islands. But you've shown that the insectivores they do quite well after the hurricane. So I guess that my question is, like, what would be your thoughts on the complexity provided by the size of the island, of these two islands in particular, and how how these other vireos in the Caribbean, how they manage to have resilience after the hurricanes?
Good question. Not a simple answer. I prepared for it. This is your question here, and you make a good point. Providencia is tiny. And if we look at a lot of the hurricane studies, these are the small islands that have been studied. I come up with the island of St. John in the US Virgin Islands, 50 square kilometers, and I believe Providencia, if you include Santa Catalina with it, let's just do that for conversation, 22 square kilometers. So this is twice the size. Then here you can look at St. Eustatius, Netherlands, Antilles, up in the northeast, 21 square kilometers. So it's actually a little smaller than those two combined, but it's got a big mountain on it. And so it's got a lot more topography. I unfortunately didn't get the elevation for St. Eustatius, but I did get it for other islands. Here's Barbuda, which is large, but it's only 38 meters above sea level. Compare that with Providencia, which, it's fairly high. It's 360 meters above sea level. Barbuda is flat, no topographic relief. That was hit by a class 5 storm that went slowly over it. Tremendous damage. They had to evacuate all of the people off of the island after the storm. And no one lived there. They couldn't live there. And there is an endemic warbler there, Setophaga, and they did surveys on it. Frank Rivera Milan did the surveys with some other people. And the endemic warbler actually, it showed a drop of, I don't remember if it was 20 or 30%, but nonetheless, the evidence now suggests they're recovering just fine. Yet this storm destroyed that island. Now, yes, more area there, so more potential refugia for recolonization and so on. And your point's well taken. I do think that your small islands have a greater risk of population loss. These other islands, of which there have been studies, St. Croix, we studied that, 215 square kilometers. That's big. San Salvador in the Bahamas, 163. I always thought that was a small island, but Providencia is quite small. I haven't been on it, because I mentioned before, I've been on San Andreas, but not Providencia. So it's quite possible that the decreases and the risk of mortality are much higher on Providencia. And what, of course, would worry me also is how much the land has been developed, how much has been lost to agriculture, how much has been lost to resort development or any sort of development of settlements and so on. As you lose that habitat, you're losing area. So the other factor that is of interest with those islands is they're isolated. All of the islands that I mentioned here are in archipelagos. In most cases, you can stand on one island and look over and see the next one. They're really not very isolated. San Salvador is a little bit isolated, I suppose, but not as isolated as your islands off of Nicaragua there. So the possibility of having a rescue, birds coming in, recolonizing and so on, it's going to be a lot slower. And the fact that the birds try and leave the island, we do know there are observations of birds leaving islands after storms. Where are they going to go? Are they going to go to Nicaragua? Quién sabe?
I do have a question. So, thank you, Professor Elio, for this very interesting talk. And I was wondering if you have any example, or if you think that this is even possible, that some species become like increase their population after the hurricane, like similar to some population patterns of invasive species. Or...
Some species will increase. You know, I certainly would expect if you get more flowering and fruiting. I can give you examples in a mature forest, not too relevant for Providencia as I understand it, but if you take off that canopy and you end up with a lot of understory shrubs, for example, a lot of Melastomataceae, rubiaceae, fruiting plants in those families, you'll have a number of birds that take advantage of that, and their populations will increase. Bananaquits, Ceraboflaviola, certainly benefit from these storms. The bird I study, a migrant in the Bahamas, benefits from hurricanes because it affects their fruiting plants. You may be familiar with the genus Lantana in the Verbenaceae, Lantana involucrata, which is widespread in the Caribbean and is also on Providencia and San Andrea. That's a plant that benefits from hurricanes. Any bird that feeds on that fruit, well, they have a potential advantage there, and birds that use shrubby areas, matorral type habitats, are likely to benefit. Mangrove species may be in trouble. If you have tall mangroves and these are damaged, it may take a while for those mangroves to come back. There are restoration efforts for mangroves where they plant them to try and bring them back, because we do know there's high mortality in mangroves. So yes, the bird community can shift, and there excuse me, there are excuse me, there are winners and losers. Let me get a drink of water. So yes, there'll be distinct winners and losers.
Thank you.
You may lose some of your pigeons.
I have a question about mangrove. I couldn't hear you the last part of your answer.
Oh, okay.
Can you hear me? Well, Providencia has basically mangrove and dry forest, plus the transformed area by agriculture and houses. So the terrestrial birds also use a lot the mangrove. Do you have any experience about potential effects or changes in mangrove communities that in the Caribbean, but not in water birds, but in terrestrial birds?
Yes, major declines in terrestrial birds. In a number of our Caribbean islands, the mangroves have the highest density of migrant, Nearctic migrant warblers during the winter months. They're a very important habitat, basically because of high insect abundance, both Rhizophora and Avicennia in particular, but also in Conocarpus. So very important for insectivorous birds. And after these storms, however, there's a lot of damage to the mangroves. And we've noticed not only the wind damage and wave water damage in Rhizophora, but even the Avicennia, for example, the black mangrove, you'll have a lot of mangroves that die, which we believe is related to having too much salt concentration in the water. In other words, the storm will push the sea waters up into the mangroves, and some of these areas may not drain well. And if you have bodies of salt water, the water evaporates, and then you have a lot of salt, and then you have the mortality of the trees. So you can have serious problems for the birds that rely heavily on those mangroves. So we are concerned about it. There are at least 2 islands that have efforts to plant mangroves underway to restore them. So they're actually planting Rhizophora in some areas. So I'm aware of some of those activities.
Okay.
One last comment or question. If Andres told you about this, but we're sort of planning a monitoring initiative for Providencia after this hurricane to try and compare and actually see what happened. We don't have an ongoing robust baseline. And I was wondering if, with all your experience, you would have like some recommendations for us that are about to start this process, or I don't know, general recommendations on how to go about the response and comparison.
I wrote out some comments on that, thinking about it beforehand. One of the common ways we've been doing it, and my talk, maybe unfortunately I didn't go into the details of my sampling protocol, but most of us for terrestrial birds have been using point counts and various duration, 5 minutes, 10 minutes, separated by, depending upon your target species, at least 150 meters or 200 meters apart. And if you are able to make multiple visits, then you can use occupancy modeling to try and control for differences in detectability. And I did send over some PDF articles showing these methods. So I would certainly encourage you to set up some point counts. You need a fairly good number of them. What's a fairly good number? Well, as many as you can get in there. You know, if you can get 50 or more, that's great. And I start them just about sunrise, and in the Caribbean, it gets pretty warm by 9:30, 10 o'clock. I don't go beyond that. But you can use time of day as a covariate. You can add a lot of covariates in these models. So that would be the way to do it. But I would encourage setting up point counts. You can do it for the entire community if you wish. And I sent over a recent paper that used point counts in Puerto Rico and used occupancy modeling. So that's a way to do that. And in terms of methods, you might want to see a number of the papers by Frank Rivera Milan. Frank has done a lot of monitoring, particularly of pigeons and doves, columbids, in Puerto Rico. He has over 30, maybe even 40 years of data of monitoring their populations, and he's gone through hurricanes and droughts and illegal hunting and you know, you name it. He's monitored through those events, and he knows those methods very well. And I, you know, if you get have some questions and stuff, he's really the expert, and he's the guy to turn to. But consider point counts. If you particularly you want to follow your vireo, of course, or vireos in plural, and your passerines, you know, I think this is, you know, pretty standard method and work fine. If you can also correct for distance, done studies now using a laser rangefinder to determine the distance between myself and the bird when I see it visually, or an estimate to where it's singing from. Using these distance measurements, we can correct for detectability, which is essential to do now. Many of my earlier studies, I did not correct for detectability, but nowadays you really do have to correct for detectability. And we know that these hurricanes can affect detectability before and after. So you'll want to do that. And if there's a easy way to monitor any food resources, I encourage you to do that. But you know, if you're really busy doing the bird counts, I understand. Or if when you're doing a point count, you have a system where you make some estimates of fruit availability, or fruit and flower availability at the site, at the point. Even if it's a subjective scale, that still could be useful. That can be used as a covariate in your models when you analyze it. And then, of course, all of the points, you would, of course, geo-reference them with a GPS unit to allow you to go back and continue to do that. And I'd encourage you to do that. I'm very pleased to hear that you're thinking of doing that. And I also encourage you to check out the Birds Caribbean website, because we have a number of groups that are looking at monitoring bird populations on islands in general. And just you know, check out our website and find some other folks who also share information with you and be happy to help.
Thanks. That's pretty much what we were thinking of doing. So that's
when are you going to get over there?
soon.
Soon.
Well, David has already been once. Maybe David can talk about that a little bit more. And well, I'm not sure exactly, but we were thinking having a first sampling season around April to get migration and breeding season data as well, and then another one at maybe October to get the full migration too, and then the response of the birds after breeding.
Okay, well, you should be able to, in your April period, also get breeding resident birds. The other thing,
exactly.
one of the things that will affect your counts, and you can use this as a covariate, but make sure you have access to, and I suspect you do, to rainfall data, because as you know, in those dry forests, a lot of the breeding is tied to rainfall, and of course that would affect detectability in terms of singing and so on. So it's useful to be able to correct for that in your monitoring program.
Okay.
Yeah, sorry, I'm not close enough to go visit Providencia. I'd like to see it.
Guys, do you have any more questions for Joe? Joe, do you have any example of an extinction because of a hurricane?
Well, I had an example that I still think is likely. You know, once you get down to extinction and small population, random events become very powerful, and all sorts of things can happen. One of the cases that we have used as an example is an example of a population of the Puerto Rican bullfinch. Loxogilla is the genus, Caribbean endemic, that was found on the island of St. Kitts up in the mountains and disappeared after some major hurricanes. And they were isolated, and my picture here, this is what St. Kitts looked like in the early 1800s, well, the 1700s and the early 1800s. The lowlands were all agriculture, sugarcane, really. And the only habitat that remained was up in a montane reserve up here. This is where the bullfinch was found. And the bullfinch had low population numbers, as best anybody could tell, according to the collectors. And in the 1890s, the island was hit by two powerful storms. Several years later, the bullfinch population disappeared. So it's possible that those hurricanes, and there were other ones too, contributed to the decline. And if you recall the story about the montane species losing their food supply, the bullfinch, of course, feeds on fruit and seeds. Had it moved to the lowlands in search of refugia, there was nothing down here except caña, sugarcane. And so there was no place for it to go. So it did not have a refugia, and it could very well have been associated with the hurricane impacts. The Puerto Rican parrot example in the Luquillo Mountains, going from 50 some birds to 2 individuals in the Luquillo Mountains, that's a local extinction. 2 individuals without intensive management, that would have been an example. I mean, they really did lose those birds, and so that. But there are not a lot of examples. There's a tortoise in the Turdidae, the thrush family, and it was endemic to the Cayman Islands. And as you know, tortoise feeds heavily on, well, fruits and insects. Their populations were quite low as a result of habitat loss in the Cayman Islands. And after several hurricanes, they disappeared. Now, did hurricane cause that, or was it the habitat loss before? Yeah, we don't know. It's a tough one.
Okay. So, Felipe.
No, yeah, I have another question. There is a tiny population of a petrel, Puffinus germinieri, in three small islets around Providencia. The numbers are very low, just like 2 or 3 pairs per islet. So let's say like 10, 15 birds in general, no more than that. I have seen pictures of those islets, and they were completely, erased by the hurricane. There's no vegetation in those islets at this moment. Do you think those birds could recover the population after some years or whatever?
Well, they're cavity nesters, right? They usually nest.
Yeah, they're cavity nesters.
Yeah, I would guess they'll come back relatively quickly. They might, they're long-lived. And if they were not in the area vicinity when the storms went through, they were out at sea somewhere else, they might miss a breeding season or two. But I would be optimistic for the recovery. And as long as you can keep rats, cats, and the other predators off of those small islands, I'd be optimistic.
Okay.
And you know, there's small populations of those throughout the Caribbean. So there are some similar stories, and there you may want to check. Birds Caribbean published a survey of the seabird colonies and their status. There may be information there. So if you haven't seen it, send me an email. I can get you a reference for it, and maybe even a PDF. That might be useful too.
All right. I have that publication. I'm trying to find it. Okay.
I think it's Schreiber and Lee who are the authors.
Yes. Yeah.
Okay, you're in good shape. Just keep those rats away. Well, you know, in some of the islands, in terms of recovery, and we're talking, if you want to talk about small islands, and these aren't bird studies, unfortunately, but they've done some very nice hurricane studies in the Bahamas. Tom Shaner and a postdoc, forgotten his first name, Schiller, I think is his last name. They have done long-term studies on small islotes, cayos. And
Yeah.
when I say small, I'm talking a quarter of a hectare. And they were looking at Anolis, the lizard populations, and also the insect and spider populations. And many of these islands were completely washed over by the recent hurricanes, and they've gone back and followed the recovery of those lizards and the insects on those very small islands that were completely destroyed. As you said, no vegetation, completely wiped out, and the lizards came back. Well, lizards, of course, can swim, and the eggs of the Anolis lizard can tolerate salt water, which is interesting. So there's actually some recruitment from within the island. There's some series of papers that they've done.
Okay.
Okay. So, Joe, we really appreciate your time. I know that you had prepared this talk specifically to tailor it to our, problems with Providencia and the storm that just happened. With the issue that we have basically zero baseline information other than, standard information, other than the surveys that Felipe has done and other people like Selva and Camila. So we really think on establishing this baseline program. So for whatever reason, it could be a storm, but also as an important contribution to understanding the dynamic of these small avifaunas. Mm-hmm. That's something that needs to be done.